Chapter 12. Hard Times. When everything was ready, the New York financiers started calling 24-hour broker call loans. This meant that the stockbrokers and the customers had to dump their stock on the market in order to pay the loans. This naturally collapsed the stock market and brought a banking collapse all over the country because the banks not owned by the oligarchy were heavily involved in broker call claims at this time, and bank runs soon exhausted their coin and currency, and they had to close. The Federal Reserve System would not come to their aid, although they were instructed under the law to maintain an elastic currency. William Bryan, The United States' Unresolved Monetary and Political Problems. After World War I, America had become the world's largest creditor nation. The money that flowed into America from the $8 billion in war loans granted to France, Great Britain, and Italy was used to fund U.S. businesses and industry and to provide loans to American workers. While Europe remained in a state of stagnancy, perpetuated by the devastation of property and loss of population caused by the war, cars, highways, bridges, manufacturing plants, hotels, theaters, and department stores were being built throughout America at an unprecedented rate. Unemployment dropped to less than 5%. Almost every home in the country had electricity. By 1920, the national income of the United States was greater than the combined incomes of Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, and 17 smaller countries. Within the next 5 years, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler emerged as the big three auto companies, and over 15 million cars were on the road. By 1926, over 200,000 gas stations had cropped up throughout the United States, and the personal fortune of John D. Rockefeller, who became the world's first billionaire in 1916, had doubled. Financial imperialism. The Federal Reserve remained wedded to the Bank of England, and Montague Norman, the governor of England's central bank, made regular trips to the United States for meetings with Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Fed. In one of his visits, Norman addressed the United States Bankers Association and spoke in glowing terms about a Great Depression that would cause millions of Americans to lose their homes and jobs. He said that such an event would make people easier to govern by the imperialism of bankers. Norman told the crowd, "Capital must protect itself in every possible way, both by combination and legislation. Debts must be collected, mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When, through the process of law, the common people lose their homes, they will become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of government, applied by a central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known among our principal men, who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. By dividing the voters through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. It is, thus, by discreet action, we can ensure for ourselves that which has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished." The dutiful audience gave him a standing ovation, heeded his words, and proceeded to institute a banking procedure known as the 24-hour call. The 24-hour call. The 24-hour call enabled investors to purchase securities on extended credit from their bankers. This meant that if someone wanted to purchase $1,000 in stock, he only had to shell out $100 in cash. The loan for the remaining $900 was immediate and readily available from every national bank in the country. If the stock increased 10% in value, an investor could double his money. In addition to enhancing one's financial portfolio, the easy money could be used to purchase homes, automobiles, and modern appliances, like self-contained refrigerators that required no ice. To fuel the market, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, proceeded to make more and more cuts to the tax rate so that Americans had more and more expendable income. For those who earned $5,000 or less, the rate fell from 15.9% in 1920 to 1.1% in 1928. Those who earned $10,000 or less saw their rate dwindled from 9.1% in 1920 to 2% in 1928. And those who earned $25,000 or less witnessed a drop in their taxable income from 16.6% in 1920 to 7.1% in 1928. Mellon had close ties to John D. Rockefeller, who had purchased his oil company at the turn of the century. Between 1923 and 1929, the Federal Reserve added helium to the financial balloon by expanding the money supply by 62%. This money was used to build up the stock market to dizzying heights. Instant riches. With credit money readily available to every Tom, Dick, and Harry, the mass media began to ballyhoo tales of the instant riches to be made in the stock market. According to Ferdinand Lundberg, for profits to be made on these funds, the public had to be induced to speculate, and it was so induced by misleading newspaper accounts, many of them bought and paid for by the brokers that operated the pools. The depletion of gold. A savvy individual could have discerned that a depression was in the works by the fact that Chase National was transporting large quantities of gold outside the country. In 1928, more than $500 million in gold bars was shipped by the Rockefeller Bank to financial firms in England and France. Since the dollar remained bound to the gold standard, the depletion of the precious metal was accompanied by a curtailment in the money supply. Everything was ripe for an economic collapse of epic proportion. On February 6, 1929, Montague Norman arrived in Washington to confer with Treasury Secretary Mellon. Immediately after the mysterious meeting, the Federal Reserve Board began to cut the money supply and to raise the interest rate. Excrement hits the fan. The collapse began when the commercial banks no longer could receive a flow of greenbacks from the Federal Reserve. Desperate for cash to continue their operations, the banks initiated the call on their loans on October 24, 1929. The millions of simple-minded blokes who had received the money so easily from their friendly neighborhood bankers were now obliged to come up with full repayment in 24 hours. The proverbial excrement hit the fan. Throughout the country, the stampede to sell stocks, insurance policies, and businesses began. The stock market crashed. Banks throughout the country ran out of cash and closed up shop, and the Fed refused to come to the rescue with a printing of fresh currency. On Tuesday, October 29th, the exchanges were crushed by a new avalanche of selling. For many securities, there were no buyers at all. By the end of the day, over 16 million shares had been dumped, in most cases at any price that was offered. Millions of investors were wiped out. Within several months of continual decline, $40 billion of wealth had vanished. Americans who believed that they were very rich suddenly discovered that they were very poor. By the end of 1929, 5,000 banks had collapsed, and 6 million Americans had lost their jobs. President Herbert Hoover could only sit back and watch as the financial devastation took place. He possessed no control over the Federal Reserve and was unable to force it to adopt the necessary rescue measures. The vultures descend. The crash may have devastated the average American investor, but not the Rockefellers. They were either out of the market or had sold short, so that they earned enormous profits as the Dow Jones plummeted. Following the crash, they swooped down on Wall Street like vultures to feast on ravaged companies. Shares that once sold for $1 now could be bought for a few pennies. The worth of John P. Kennedy, a smuggler and bootlegger, increased from $4 million to $100 million. Similarly, while businesses went belly up throughout the country, the Rockefeller concerns, including Standard Oil and International Harvester, experienced enormous expansion. Economic collapse set the Rockefellers up to gain monopolistic control over every necessity of life and source of energy: oil, gas, coal, water, wind, and atomic energy. They had even succeeded in making the sun, the greatest of all sources of power, render them tribute. In addition, the family began to gobble up real estate in major American cities. By 1935, they owned 3% of the property in New York City. They became the largest holders of government securities, including the NYC and State of New York bonds, and public utility companies, including Consolidated Edison, the Manhattan Elevated Railroad Company, the Manhattan Transit Corporation, the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, NYC, the United Gas Improvement Company, Public Service of New Jersey, Peoples Gas of Chicago, Mountain Fuel Supply, Colorado Interstate Gas Company, Mutual Fuel Gas Company, Chicago Railways Company, the Philadelphia Company, et alia. They gained control not only of America's railroads, leading industrial corporations, and mines, but also of the nation's major food suppliers, including Armour and Company, one of the 5 leading firms in the meatpacking industry, the Corn Products Refining Company, which supplied the raw material for cornstarch and corn oil, Sheffield Farms, which represented the largest dairy in the world, Borden's, which was the world's largest producer of dairy and pasta products, and Monsanto, an agrochemical and agricultural biotech company that developed genetically modified organisms, GMOs. The world and its riches. The decisions of the corporate executives within the boardrooms of the Rockefeller Empire were made solely on the basis of self-perpetuation and expansion. No considerations of altruism, let alone national well-being, were superseded by profit. The end was gain, and the purpose of the holdings could only be fulfilled when the Rockefeller dynasty gained sole possession of the world's wealth. The Protocols of Zion. With the gold that the Rockefellers exported to England and France, they purchased 69,020 shares of the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company from the Rothschilds and 50% of the Nobel Oil Works. In 1893, John D. had tried to forge a union with the Rothschilds and Nobel for control of the Russian oil fields, but that effort was thwarted by Sir Henry Detterding, the Royal Dutch director, who knew that Rockefeller was adept at backstabbing. The setback forced Rockefeller to adopt other measures. In The Federal Reserve Conspiracy and Rockefellers, Emmanuel M. Josephson writes, "The situation left only 2 methods open to the Rockefeller interests to gaining access to the Russian oil fields, other than the prohibitively expensive and futile attempt to purchase control of the Royal Dutch in the open stock market. Their first approach was to create a breach between the Tsarist regime and the Royal Dutch management. The second was to oust the Tsarist regime by financing, with the funds of American taxpayers derived through their tax-exempt foundations, a revolution in Russia. The Rockefeller conspirators adopted both approaches. For the purpose of attempting to create a breach between the Tsarist regime and the Royal Dutch Company, there was effected the publication in Russia and widespread distribution under the name of a Captain Linus, a notorious forged document labeled the Protocols of Zion. The Protocols of Zion purportedly represents the minutes of 24 meetings held secretly by Jewish bankers and financiers who sought to control the world. The 12th Protocol says, "Literature and journalism are 2 of the most important educative forces, and therefore our government will become proprietor of the